We're going to switch to English now. Thank you very much. We have a standing panel with Gustavo and Leo, two key actors in the stabilization plans of Brazil and Israel. As it was mentioned, Leo, due to the difficult situation in Israel, was not able to travel to Argentina. He has generously recorded his exposition, and he's going to join us live for Q&A and a dialogue with Gustavo and us later. So if you agree, Gustavo, we'll start with you to talk about the real plan. Thank you very much for coming.
You're welcome. Good afternoon, you all. Let me start by saying it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I would like to thank Governor Pausili, Vice Governor Wedding, and staff for hospitality and the invitation. My second observation before starting is an apology for the English. You don't want to hear my Spanish, which is actually as a Portuguese with a fabricated accent, which is a reminder of our identities. We have many similarities, but the difference tends to be the important things to discuss in events like that. It's 30 years of the Real Plan. In Brazil, we have been involved in several celebrations. Strangely, at 30, there's celebration. There hasn't been any celebrations before that. There's been some strange thing about 30 years. So after 30 years, if you beat inflation, hyperinflation, they're going to celebrate you, but only after 30 years. I propose to address the topic of the Real Plan in four main headings. The first one is the diagnosis, the hyperinflation diagnosis, something very heavy. Second is how currency reform takes place. I'll use, of course, Brazilian case. Some technical notes and the record, what happened exactly in Brazil and lessons we can draw. Let's start with that thing working out. Okay, hyperinflation. I heard that word a couple of times during the morning in the previous presentations. Good to go into precise definitions. It's when you say to a politician, we have a hyperinflation, it's like to give someone a cancer diagnostic, you know, it's heavy. What is the historical evidence? Philip Kagan was the one, a pioneer in studying the phenomenon, and his definition, there isn't much theory about it, but it has become the norm. A hyperinflation starts the month inflation reaches 50% per month, okay? And that's when a hyperinflation episode starts. And it ends, when it ends, it's easier to spot. And then we have had 24 episodes of hyperinflation, according to a now classic 2002 study. There's been a couple of other episodes after that, but these are ones in which there are numbers like that organized, and from the table we can see that Hungary was the worst of all. Well, Argentina would be number 17, Brazil number 23, ranking these cases according to the worst cumulated inflation during the episode. But that's 50% per month as a threshold for the starting of the process. If we work with a different threshold, say 100%, 12-month accumulated inflation for the moment it starts the episode until it ends, then there are 45 episodes up to 2002, and guess who are the countries leading the pack in terms of being the worst cases? Well, Brazil and Argentina. That's surprising because before that, I guess, the sensation was that when we talk about hyperinflation, it's it comes with wars and big dislocations, earthquakes and revolutions and all that. But no, we're talking to peacetime countries, which maybe it's even more complex when there's no big dislocation. Well, through time, the evolution of inflation in Brazil looks like that. It's a logarithm scale. Those that are learned about this concept could help, the oldest price index we have in Brazil is the cost of living in São Paulo. If you make it number one in March 1939, the price level in December 2013 will be this number you can see in the top right side of the slide. If you are going to do a graph about this number, it's going to be like over the roof. So it has to be a log scale to see something civilized as a just upward sloping graph, which, however, shows in the 15 years, more or less, between the beginning of the 80s until the mid-90s, the average monthly inflation was 16% per month, okay? And it's not only being a high rate, but it's a very long episode. So the distortions caused by inflation are huge in several ways. And, well, I think we're talking about something familiar. In Brazil, however, we have done some few things different from Argentina. One was currency reforms along the way. In 1942, Cruzeiro replaced the mil-réis, the currency Brazil has had since the colonial times. And since then, 8 monetary reforms. 8. I think it's a world record. Some of the reforms, call them type A, are like changing units. You introduce a new currency, 1,000 of the old, and life goes more or less the way it was. We've done it several times. A type A reform are like the first 3 and the number 6, but others are like shocks in which the reform changes things, changes contracts, indexation clauses, they change payments in a number of ways, and in the limit, they can do what we call in Portuguese confiscos, which is to expropriate wealth or many ways from people, and it's called Gurley type. John Gurley was an economist that studied several monetary reforms done in Europe after World War II, in which the objective was to diminish liquidity and extract wealth from people. And the most popular, most interesting of all them, the German one, but also the Soviet Union reform, which, we have to do reforms like that, countries with high inflation, because of something very trivial, not always duly considered. The size of the pieces of paper you will have to carry with you to make a purchase, right? The example here, considering our case, the parity of 1 real 1994 against Cruzeiro's 1942 would make this big number, I don't know even how to pronounce it. It's like 6 rows of 3 zeros. And imagine, this is, you can see in the picture, is a billion in bills of 100, okay? So if you're going to buy a Big Mac, be ready to go with a truck. Or else the central bank does something very funny, like issuing notes with obscenely large denominations. That's true. It's not fake news. It's actually a numismatic treat. You can buy it at the internet. But in the Brazilian case, even if you have a 100 trillion bill in Cruzeiros of 1942, it will take like 100,000 such notes to buy 1 Big Mac, right? It's worse than that iconic German 1923 picture you see there. we have to pay attention to these details. And one thing to note is that you should never issue a 1 million bill, okay? Any central bank issuing 1 million bill should have its license cut, right? We've almost did it in August 1993 with Cruzeiros Reais, and we had this 500,000 bill with writer Mário de Andrade, and we already, under Cardoso, we made this reform, only cutting zeros, 1,000 Cruzeiros Reais, 1,000 Cruzeiros became 1,000 Cruzeiros Reais, and stamped the notes, and life went on. There are incredible details about the hyperinflation experience. Other countries should be more puzzled with that than Argentina. But technical features of the Real Plan, our solution for the problem. First concept, we wanted to reverse engineer the impact inflation did to the currency. It goes function by function. Money loses the store of value function first, then loses the unit of account function second, and lastly, in some few cases, you lose also the means of payment function. That's chaos. When you go reverse engineer that, in our case, we verified that, well, the payment system was actually very agile to handle the daily problems of living under very high inflation. Also, people had money substitutes as store of value that, not much of a problem. The big problem was the unit of account, the indexation issue. Several types of indexations coexisting. We didn't have dollarization like in many other countries, more open economies. The dollar is very little used, unrestricted, as indexation in Brazil. So that we had like several subsystems of indexations varying according to the index and according to the frequency of the readjustment. Even within the same family of indices, sometimes one type of contract was on the peak, the other was on the valley. Whose national wage policy was like that. It was crazy. Every time you took a picture of the price system, we would have it all over the place. Something had to be done to make the price system find solutions for one system of relative prices, not so much distorted for you to go on with a new currency. So the unit of account was our first focus when thinking about reconstruction. There are several cases of attempts to centralize the unit of account function. The ECU in Europe was one, not so much successful. We thought about doing something which we could describe as a proxy dollarization, and details of what it means. First, that we didn't want de-indexation. I would explain in a minute why de-indexation is a problem, not a solution to what we have in our mind. We wanted to take advantage of one little fundamental thing about dollarization, is that fact that once you do something with the exchange rate, you transmit that immediately to all prices. We didn't have that in Brazil, as the indexation function was fragmented. There are many units of account in the country. So how to make them all become one, and also that being connected with the dollar. That was that thing called URV, Unidade Real de Valor, was the acronym we've chosen for that, to be something like, in the Middle Ages, we called it imaginary currencies. It was like the gold mark or the gold pound, some unit of account of the past that had constant chasing power, and that would be perhaps the official unit of account. But in order for this to be the country's unit of account, we had to make people choose it. And let's take them Gresham's law to our advantage in the field of units of account. That is, people will choose the best currency, even if it's only the unit of account currency, and abandoning the use of the worst. And there was one good thing about URV, that is to move towards a daily indexation system in which you have more or less the concept that one URV is more or less equal to $1, but the more or less part is very important. It's like a proxy thing, not a full dollarization. And the next thing, more daring move would be, once you have that unit of account that everybody likes, then you transform that into the national currency. It sounds simple on paper, but that was exactly what was done. That was welcomed in Brazil because we were sort of exhausted of those things called heterodox shocks. That is something that politicians like a lot, because it's like saying, like believing that inflation is a crime, which may well be, but then instead of doing policy, they call the police, okay? It's treat inflation as something that you can prohibit people from raising prices, it's a price freeze, and prohibit people to enter into indexed contracts, that is, force people into money illusion. Two forms of violence, characteristics of heterodox shocks. We wanted to avoid both. So do something voluntary. People would go to the URV as they wish, as a voluntary decision. And that was more or less the way people saw URV as a unit of account of constant purchasing power. There's a triangle. On the left side, there's an indexation rule that says the URV evolves according to inflation, as measured by the average of three popular indices privately done and trustworthy and all that. So the URV is just another unit of account. The central bank, on the other hand, that's the right side of the triangle, was instructed to sell dollars at the URV every day. So our crawling peg would be done according to the URV. So far, nothing especially strange, but that triangle made one URV be more or less equal to $1. And we have been doing that before with a fiscal unit called UFIR. The same mechanics, so that was familiar to taxpayers. And imagine, this was easier to understand for housewives, because if you ask a housewife what is the real value of things in the supermarket, they understand. There's nothing mysterious about the fact that the value of things in a hyperinflation process is not what is written on the note, right? Is what you can buy with the note. And that you learn in school when you're young. Housewives understood URV very easily, rapidly. In something like 2 weeks, I would say, everybody was marveled with URVs and quoting prices in URVs, and that was fantastic. Well, easy part. Second part would be, imagine this triangle, but you take away Cruzeiro Real. Cruzeiro Real now ceases to exist. Without the indexation clause, what would then determine the value of the URV? According to the law, that moment the Cruzeiro Real is demonetized, URV becomes the national currency and has its name changed to Real. Real today are URVs of the past. So the question is, what happens at the day Cruzeiro Real disappear? What would be the value of that thing? And then the record of currency reforms would be, well, that's the moment the central bank steps in and said, well, it's $1, and I'm ready to sell or buy according to that rate. That would be one possibility, but we have chosen to go otherwise. We floated the new currency, simply floated it. And most people expected us to fix the exchange rate and even to devalue at the onset to build some fat for a long period ahead of us with fixed rates and inflation going on. But no, we just floated it. Let's see what happens. And what happens was that the new currency appreciated with respect to the dollar, went below $1. So this $1 was like 83 cents of real at a point, which was so remarkable in Brazil, where we have never seen this happening as a market outcome. There's no question it's easy for any central bank to fix the exchange rate for a week, but as a market outcome, to appreciate with respect to the dollar, that was magic. In our case, we kind of knew that this was going to happen because, the previous 2 years before that specific moment, July 1994, we were, with the central bank, we're buying like $1 billion per month, every month. Prior to that, it's also true that the one thing interesting, the premium between the black market and the official market was negative, right? So there was a sort of excess dollars. Let's take excess dollars to our advantage. It's a little opportunistic, of course, but you have to be opportunistic when you find hyperinflation. But see, in the law, we put several things that people said they're going to be essential to build confidence. And then my opinion on things that worked, things that did not. A limit to the issue of the new currency. People didn't understand, didn't care. We're going to see it later. The other thing was earmarking international reserves to show that the issue of the new currency on day one would be equivalent to like 15% of what we had in international reserves, so we could do a convertibility thing if we wanted. And even after remonetization, that was tripled to something like 45% of reserves. Nobody gave attention to that. That's incredible. Things that I think have worked very well to perform that magic. I start with sustaining the expectation of reforms and fundamental things are being done, right? Not only you have to do these things, you cannot lie, of course, but you have to do things in a way that every day you have to have something to say. That sustained the momentum of optimism, of belief on what you're doing. You're addressing fundamentals, but you have to manage these expectations as a daily affair. That's one lesson. Second thing, people paid attention to the fact that we changed the governance of monetary institutions. And in our case, this was not only empowering the central bank by the president over microphones across the country. It was impossible to give central banks independence at that particular point. It will require changing the constitution. But we could do something that was very important. It was to render obsolete the National Monetary Council. In Brazil, there's this council on top of the central bank, instructing the central bank what to do. And we have sort of extinguished that council, made it obsolete, and nobody knows in Brazil what this council means or where it is located. Everybody knows about one new council that today is the father of monetary policy, the COPOM, the Committee on Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Brazil. Everybody knows that. That was something that was very effective. Someone is taking care of the currency now. That's huge. Interest rates are also huge, okay? There's no escape from that. I'm sorry. Surprise is good because you're managing expectations. That sounds pretty subjective, but important. Previous work in abolishing exchange controls and addressing the black premium in the black market was important to make floating of the currency more of a phenomenon. We've been working on removing controls, and all of a sudden, this float is an honest float. And in an honest float, the real passed the test, okay? Well, another thing important, of course, is having a chance to elect the president, to make Cardoso the president. That's not trivial, of course. And in April 1994, Cardoso left the Ministry of Finance to run for president, and he was elected on the first round in October that same year. See, that Cardoso started as finance minister in May 1993. Start the watch there in less than 1 year and a half. That person taking over the finance ministry was a discredited fourth finance minister of President Franco, is elected president on the first round after having won over hyperinflation. That was a miracle. Cardoso, in his book, autobiographical book in English, this is titled "The Accidental President of Brazil." That's an accident, never to be repeated, I guess. But see, this is the first day, and we're talking about first opening moves. Think of a chess game. We had a good opening, right? As your adversary is a sort of a Russian master that you eat you for lunch if you do any mistake. But that's how it started, floating. As you see it there in the graph, the first first 8 months, it was floating unrestrictedly, and then we started to implement some limitations to the float after the tequila thing in the end of 1994. There was some pressure in the market, so they started to depreciate too fast, and we started to intervene and then establish this European target zone system that changed accordingly, and we did that until 1998, okay? That was our system, while the other part of the army was fighting the fundamentals, okay? This is just decoration if you don't do anything on the other side, but the other side was working. So let's talk about the record and wrap up. I don't have much time, I think. It's 0 there, but maybe a couple of minutes more, I finish. Well, these are monthly inflation rates. The year of 1994, we moved from 46.7, that was the last monthly variation of URV, into like 6.7 at first reading of CPI after the monetary reform, then 1.5, and then you see hyperinflation is over, I'm afraid. This one graph here is more to what happened after the new currency was in the battlefield after floating, and it's long. And this is 12-month accumulated inflation after the real was issued. Of course, I wanted to eliminate the inflation in the first semester of 1994. If you do a 12-month accumulated inflation in August, you will take like 11 months of hyperinflation and 1 of the new currency. So what you see for the first 12 months in this graph is the monthly inflation annualized, or the monthly 2-month inflation annualized, the 3-month inflation annualized until you have 12 months. That permits us to see how gradual it was. The first month after the real plan, it was 6.7, the CPI for July. That's about 120% per year, right? And then the next month, it was, the monthly reading was like 1.5, and then it goes down to something like 61%, and then it goes down slowly until beginning 1997, we fell below 5% per year, and in the calendar year 1998, it was 1.6 per year, okay? That's US inflation. That's the first part of the program was something like a high technology attack with the monetary reform and all that. But that part of the program is the infantry, okay? The infantry goes on. of course, the cavalry has been working. The cavalry of the fiscal accounts was working, and that's see the cavalry now. When you look into the numbers for the primary surplus, it looks like it all started in 1999. By the time the IMF agreement was starting, it looks like the IMF performed a miracle. No, please don't. Lots of things you do to adjust the fiscal accounts. The first impact is negative, like when you recognize banks in trouble, public banks in trouble, you recognize big losses, that goes into the primary deficit, okay? But then after that, the next exercise, you start to see the impacts. So in like from one quarter to the other, at the beginning of 1999, we moved from approximately 0 to approximately 3% of GDP of surplus, where we remained for many years, as you see. This timing is a bit of a mystery, because the fiscal adjustment seems to happen after the fact. But see, markets anticipate things. If you don't lie, of course, if you are doing the stuff markets believe will be effective. That's what we did. Then when these numbers appeared, it was like ancient news, okay? But you don't kill a hyperinflation without that part, okay? And that's 3% of GDP. That's a lot in terms of... one mystery, but helps to understand how unique that thing was, is what happened to the exchange rate in 1999 after the opening moves and all that. That's so interesting. But then in 1999, the currency floats and goes from 1.22 to like 1.87 on average for the 6 months following the float that was in January 1999. What happens then? That's the end of it, right? No, I'm afraid not. At that particular point, that was the point I left the central bank, Arminio Fraga started and brought, well, inflation targets, then the full impact of the IMF agreement. The fiscal adjustment was then there, okay, and the currency was going to float. Notice that the real was floated twice. First, on the month of July 1994, it appreciated. The second time, it was January 1999, big depreciation, okay? What was the inflationary impact of this big devaluation? Very little. These are annual rates. See, the first arrow is the fact that inflation moved from something like, it was on the target, which was below 5% per year, and moved to something like 8% per year, big inflationary impacts in the eyes of today. That time was like piece of cake. And then nothing. We see a second spike in inflation, and that was related to the moment we had the 2002 election that Lula was going to win and probably destroy everything. The exchange rate went to 4, and that thing produced an inflationary spike that put the annual number a little below 20% per year, okay? But that's entirely different game than we had before. Hyperinflation was a thing of the past, and we are now under a new regime. And to finish, that's it. These are the numbers. Depreciation in 1999, January was 78% to the dollar. That's is going to be over. No, it wasn't. Whatever other things we were doing on the fundamental side, reflecting on the fiscal numbers, were completed or next to completed, so that a big depreciation didn't have an inflationary impact. It took perhaps those 5 years of target zones plus bans plus every day bombing the news with reforms and things that built confidence. That's a pretty unique experience. Last comment I would do is that not many things, well, many things, but not all things in this trajectory were planned, right? You start with a good idea, you go along with it. It's a chess game, have a good opening, then you get to mid-game, and you do stuff in the mid-game, use monetary policy, conventional instruments, do the right thing. Well, the end game could be, a disaster, but it wasn't, right? Because we have done our homework. And it's not always planned, but if you have the right team and the right ideas, you get there to the end. It's been 30 years ago, okay? This is not an imaginary situation. That is real. And we're celebrating 30 years of that. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Okay. As Mauro mentioned, after hearing this fantastic and very ingenious experience in the case of Brazil, and happy birthday, we appreciate really. We are going to hear or to see share with you a video from Leonardo Leiderman that after this video is going to join us for a brief conversation. Okay?
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Santiago Bausili, President of the Banco Central, and Vladimir Verning, Vice President of the bank, for inviting me to participate in this very important conference. At the same time, I would like to congratulate both of you and your team at the bank for your very professional and focused work that is a key component of the success of the whole stabilization plan and the focus of reducing inflation thus far this year. My original plan was to travel to Buenos Aires and to attend physically the conference today and tomorrow. Yet, as you know, Israel is now under a difficult, painful, and escalating war. Accordingly, it seemed safer for me not to travel at this time. I thank Santiago and Vladimir for their understanding and for agreeing that my presentation today would be recorded in Tel Aviv, something we did a few days ago, and what follows is the result of that. I would like to make 3 remarks at the start of my talk today. The first one is that the Israeli stabilization program of 1985 has been analyzed and studied in detail in previous work, including by myself. I'm sure that most of the participants here today are familiar with the main features of the program. In order to avoid repetition and to be useful for the types of dilemmas that economists and policymakers in Argentina are facing now, my main focus will be on transition issues, having to do mainly with the shift in Israel to a flexible exchange rate regime and inflation targeting as the framework for monetary policy. My second remark is that there are many substantial differences between the conditions that prevailed in Israel at the time and in Argentina at the start of each of the stabilization programs. In my view, the initial conditions in Argentina at the start of this year have been significantly worse and more difficult than those of Israel in the mid-1980s. This fact should be taken into account when making comparisons among the different programs. Initial conditions were different and, as pointed out, on the negative side from the point of view of Argentina. Third, as economists, we have to recognize loud and clear that there is no such thing as an ideal stabilization program. What would be an ideal program? It would be one that comes out of broad political and social consensus, that puts forward a new set of fundamentals and structural reforms, and results in quick disinflation with no marked rise in unemployment or a fall in output. Well, as indicated, life is more difficult. Theory and evidence indicate that there is no such thing as an ideal program. All stabilizations involve trade-offs and dilemmas, and it is for policymakers to decide how these should be resolved. There is no unique recipe from this point of view. In spite of its remarkable success, Israel's stabilization involved costs and trade-offs that were far from being negligible. Chart 1 in the presentation gives the picture for annual inflation in Israel before and after the July 1985 program. It can be seen that the acceleration of inflation started around the year of 1973 and reached a peak of about 450% per year in the first half of 1985. Two main factors accounted for the rise in inflation. First, following the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, there was a steep increase in government spending, mainly on defense, and the rise in public sector deficits. Part of these were financed via money creation. No doubt, fiscal dominance was quite significant. As shown in charts 2 and 3, the government budget deficit reached about 17% of GDP before the program was enacted, and government debt as percent of GDP increased well above 200%. The second factor behind the rise in inflation was the existence of a wide system or regime of indexation that translated one-time jumps in the price level into an elevated rate of inflation. This included indexation of wages, the nominal exchange rate, interest rates, housing prices, and rentals, and government set prices of basic food, transportation, energy, and other items. The conclusion was that in order to stop inflation, it was required to deal simultaneously with both factors above. In other words, it seemed that relying only on an orthodox approach would not be sufficient to stop inflation inertia and could result in substantial social and economic costs. It was then, under the leadership of Professor Michael Bruno, first as an academic and then as governor of the Bank of Israel, that an heterodox program was designed. Along with an orthodox component of a significant cut in government spending and a rise in taxes, the program was based on what Bruno termed multiple nominal anchors. After a marked fiscal contraction and a devaluation of about 20%, agreements were reached for a temporary freeze of wages, prices, exchange rates, and credit. Michael Bruno referred to this social pact approach as therapy by consensus. It can be seen from chart 4 that there was a rapid disinflation following the implementation of the program. Specifically, the inflation rate went below 20% per year quite immediately, as well as on average over the first 5 years of the program. Then, the additional progress on this inflation was that inflation reached 10% per year in the first half of the 1990s, and this was followed by inflation rates below 5% per year on average toward the end of the 1990s. Since then, over more than 2 decades, inflation has been within target, which means within the range of 1 to 3% per year. The next slide summarizes the main outcomes of the program: a sharp fiscal contraction, rapid disinflation, a mixed path for real wages, a temporary private consumption boom, something that has been quite typical of heterodox programs, and no major negative impact on growth and the unemployment rate. An additional outcome has been a real exchange rate appreciation, a phenomenon that I'm sure that is of great interest now here in Argentina for policymakers, market participants, and the public at large. Let me turn to this issue of real exchange rate appreciation and foreign exchange rate policy right now. Theory and evidence indicate that the process of disinflation in small open economies, where the nominal exchange rate has played a key role as a nominal anchor and as a base for indexing of prices of goods, assets, and other items, typically requires a period during which nominal exchange rate depreciation is at a much lower rate than the rate of inflation. Chart 5 presents the graphs for two definitions of the real exchange rate. One based on relative consumer price indices, CPIs, and the other based on wholesale price indices denoted by WPI. It can be seen that at impact following the initial devaluation, of course, the real exchange rate depreciated or devalued by about 17%. Yet immediately after that, we started a process of real exchange rate appreciation. This was, in some sense, a reflection of the fact that while inflation was declining, it was still at a rate higher than the rate of nominal exchange rate depreciation, okay? A phenomenon that, again, should be familiar to much of the audience and the conference participants. Accordingly, in the area marked by the letter A in red in the graph, we can see that the real exchange rate appreciation reached about 24% real exchange rate appreciation from the devalued level at impact at the start of the program up until the time that is indicated in the chart. However, taking the real exchange rate level of 1984 as a base, in other words, not taking the immediately devalued real exchange rate, but the level before the program started being implemented, we see that the real exchange rate appreciation reached about 14%. The same applies for looking at point B in the same chart or the same graph. Let me make this point clear. There is reason to believe that some appreciation of the real exchange rate is a common feature of disinflation episodes. In fact, I don't know of any successful stabilizations that manage to maintain a stable or even a rising or devalued real exchange rate throughout the period of disinflation. As far as the exchange rate policy is concerned, here I have in mind the nominal exchange rate, a fixed exchange rate was maintained at the start of the program for about a year. It should be emphasized that no clear exit strategy from this regime was announced at the start of the program, but it was stipulated and it was declared that there could be discrete devaluations from time to time. Those devaluations, or the potential for them, were seen as necessary adjustments should the rise in prices and wages continue significantly over time. Then, to introduce some limited flexibility in terms of the exchange rate regime, from 1989 to 1991, an horizontal exchange rate band was established, but there were frequent devaluations of the central parity rate, again due to the fact that prices and wages were still rising at a rate much higher than the one that was targeted. Given the need for frequent exchange rate adjustments described in the recent discussion, and to have a more credible scheme rather than rely on discrete devaluations that no one knows, that there is a lot of uncertainty about when the next one is going to happen, an approach was implemented, one that recognizes that domestic inflation will remain for some time above foreign inflation, and in that context, a crawling band was adopted at the start of 1992. The slope of the crawling band was set as the difference between Israel's inflation target rate, that was by then announced, and the forecast of foreign inflation. I repeat that. The slope of the crawling band was determined as the difference between the target for domestic inflation minus a forecast of foreign inflation. The width of the band was increased over time, and in the early 2000s, the band was completely eliminated and a full float was adopted up until now. Chart 6 shows the nominal exchange rate of the domestic currency vis-a-vis a basket of foreign currencies that included as main components the US dollar and the euro. Area A in the graph applies to the fixed exchange rate maintained immediately after the start of the program. Then we move on to Area B, which belongs to the time of an horizontal exchange rate band. Area C then shows the exchange rate behavior under a crawling band that, as indicated, was expanding its width over time. And then Area D is related to the second half of the 1990s, a time at which, for a variety of reasons, the exchange rate became pegged to the lower, that is the most appreciated level of the band, to be discussed soon. I mean, this episode in which the exchange rate, rather than fluctuate within the band, was kind of for market reasons and as a result of market developments, was kind of pegged to the lower limit of the band. Area E shows an asymmetric and very wide band that for practical purposes functioned as a floating exchange rate. The band was eliminated in the early part of the 2000s. The next feature to be discussed here is the adoption of inflation targeting, IT, as the framework for monetary policy. This was seen as the proper framework given the advances at disinflation and the move toward exchange rate flexibility. The key challenge for monetary policy was to generate a convergence of domestic inflation to that of Israel's major trading partners. That was the main goal. The Bank of Israel played a key role in advancing this goal. Initially, a point target was set annually, but later on, an inflation target range was used in a multi-year fashion. Targets decreased from annual inflation of 10% for 93 to a range of 2 to 3% per year in 2002. The current target is 1 to 3% per year, and this is where we have seen inflation for most of the last decade or two in Israel. From the end of 1994, the Bank of Israel began to use the interest rate as a tool for attaining inflation targets. Okay? Before that, the main role of monetary policy was basically to support the fixed exchange rate and to deal with capital flows. But since 1994, basically there was I would say, a modernization and adaptation of monetary policy to a framework where the exchange rate became flexible. In this sense, the monetary policy framework from then on became similar to those of inflation targeting countries at the time, like Canada, the United Kingdom, and Sweden. We can see chart 7 for the development of annual inflation and forward-looking break-even inflation in relation to the inflation targets set for each period. Last, it is instructive to illustrate with Israel's evidence some of the dilemmas and difficulties that could arise for monetary policy as a result of the presence of multiple goals for such a policy, for monetary policy. In our case, in Israel, the challenge was how to manage simultaneously an inflation target together with an exchange rate band, okay? And for this purpose, we can go back to area D of the exchange rate chart number 6. Faced with the rise in inflation forecasts and market-based inflation expectations, partly due to a significant fiscal expansion and substantial wage concessions, increases in wages to the public sector, the central bank, the Bank of Israel, tightened policy by hiking the policy rate in the second half of the 90s, the period we are analyzing right now. From chart 8, we can see that contractionary monetary policy resulted in ex-ante real interest rates of 6 to 8% per year. Okay, we can sort of, in some sense, define this as the toughest or the most contractionary aspect of monetary policy in Israel over that period, as to be quantified in terms of an ex-ante real interest rate between 6 and 8% per year. As a result of the increase in the interest rate differential, capital flows and carry trades surged, resulting in exchange rate appreciation to the lower or most appreciated limit of the band. In order to defend the band, the central bank intervened in the foreign exchange market, purchasing part of the increased capital inflow. But most of the FX purchases had to be sterilized, thus resulting in higher market rates and a substantial quasi-fiscal cost of sterilization. This is illustrated in chart 9, where we see that there were years in which these quasi-fiscal costs amount to 1% of GDP, quite a significant cost. Finally, although I'm not an expert on Argentina's economy, not even of Cordoba's economy, my natal city, I would like to put forward a few conclusions relevant for the current juncture in Argentina. First, I strongly support the view by the central bank and other authorities here that very strict fiscal policy should be the pillar of any stabilization in Argentina. This will have to be maintained over time, and of course, not an easy job. Second, it is very important to plan ahead for exit strategies. I repeat that, exit strategies from the current juncture of multiple monetary policy and exchange rate policy targets. As you know, the coexistence of multiple targets, such as the current crawling peg, an international reserves target, multiple exchange rates, the cepo, and others can make the job of monetary policy more difficult and less effective than otherwise. As Israel's program shows, one should not wait too much with moving toward the ultimate goal of having a flexible exchange rate system, free capital markets, and a well-focused and effective monetary policy. Third, there is a basic non-linearity in the disinflation process. To put this very simply, it is easier in some sense to reduce inflation from 400% per year to 50% per year than to reduce inflation from 50% per year to 10% or even single-digit rates. Patience will be needed, and I think the beginning and what has been accumulated in terms of experience so far this year is very satisfactory, but as indicated, as time goes on, making further progress on this inflation becomes more and more difficult. The fourth, as discussed earlier, is that in order for this inflation to succeed, some degree of real exchange rate appreciation and relatively high real interest rates will be needed. This is part of the transmission mechanism. There is no need to be scared of this phenomena. One has to recognize them as part of the side effects of a cure that is badly needed in an economy after so many crises like Argentina. So, thank you all very much. Argentina has opened a new significant episode in its history, and I'm hopeful that continuing with the current policy approach while making the necessary adjustments and not delaying them for too long is the right way to go. Again, thank you.
Bad example.
Thank you very much, Leo. I think, well, Leo should be connected. We're going to have some time for a brief discussion. I'm going to start with a question for both of you. I tend to think that these stabilization programs you described and were key parts of were quite bumpy roads. Yes, they were not as easy as they seem now 30 or 40 years ago. In fact, Gustavo, you talked about a chess game with against a fierceful Russian opponent, and Leo talked about a non-stabilization plan being ideal and always having dilemmas and troubles to face. I want to maybe take you back to those moments in which you had to suffer those dilemmas, difficult moments. Which were the kind of trade-offs you faced, and how you took the decisions, and well, just want to hear which was your experience as key policymakers in these programs. Let's start with you, Gustavo.
Well, I liked the terminology non-linear, where you said bumpy. Non-linear looks pretty clean, and but that's in our case, we floated the currency at one point, and 5 years later floated again with very different results. That's non-linear, right? Bumpy, yes, because when you start, it's I love to see that from the presentation in Israel. There is no solution when you start, because you don't have the fiscal, you don't have anything, and you start working and you create conditions to do stuff, right? And then your horizons keep amplifying. But in the beginning, I think as a rule, real life stabilization policies, you see nothing. It's only in textbooks you see like regime changes like that and magic cuts in M or G minus T. No, that doesn't happen in real life. That's my answer.
Thank you. Leo?
Leonardo?
Yes, hi, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the technical team behind the scenes that has facilitated this transatlantic conversation. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay, so look, in Israel, one of the problems that we had was, contrary to Argentina, and I don't know about Brazil, that there was a very sharp debate between the central bank and the Ministry of the Economy, okay? In what sense? In the sense that in the Ministry of the Economy, I'm talking about mostly now about the transition process, because I think it's the most interesting part now for Argentina rather than the beginnings. You guys have begun with the right foot. I mean, with the right feet, the idea of making the proper fiscal adjustments and so on. But people at the Treasury were very much afraid of financial liberalization, of foreign exchange market liberalization, of speculative capital flows, and they were very much in favor of maintaining the fixed exchange rate as much as possible. Whereas we at the central bank were noticing, and we took a pioneering work in the reforms of the market, we were seeing a lot of liquidity, many participants, and we had, of course, enough international reserves to intervene should that be the case. And so the whole process of gradually moving towards the inflation target and towards more exchange rate flexibility was quite painful in that sense. And there was a point that maybe this is not very well known because it's part of the transition, that the prime minister decided to go with us at the central bank, and the finance minister resigned due to that. Okay, so as you said before, things that may look ideal on the textbook. Another point. That the government cabinet meeting that in which it was decided on to launch the program on July 1st of 1985 lasted for 20 hours. 20 hours, and poor guy Michael Bruno had to convince the ministers that they were very much afraid of what we just discussed, the potential impact on unemployment, the potential impact of reducing many of the transfers and subsidies that were part of the government budget, part of the government expenditures, and for political short-term reasons, And so something that now looks like a very consensual view and something very well orchestrated, there were difficulties behind the scenes.
Okay, really interesting to hear and in a way understand why, for example, in your presentation, Leonardo, you say, well, probably you need to go or to have an exit strategy from multiple nominal anchors, but at the same time, when we saw your presentation, you saw almost a decade in a way of a transit toward flexibility. In that sense, I would like to hear from you, both of you, because in the case of Brazil, we saw two different experiences of trying to introduce floating at the same time, in a way reverting for different reasons to some, administer exchange rate. And it's a difficult topic for our countries in a sense, for example, that in recent days we saw some research results coming from the IMF that, for example, introduce the possibility to complement the tools, the box of tools that we have in terms of that accepting that in sometimes you can have, for example, some, intervention in the exchange rate market or complement that with the inflation targeting regime with macroprudential measures or for example, in some occasions, to have some limited capital flow measures. In that sense, I would like to hear from you, what are your reactions taking into account?
Okay, let me start here and then hear Gustavo. I think every country has to make its own choices, okay? It's very easy for us as external advisors to say this and that, but countries differ. Based on my experience in Israel, and I have been in Brazil with Arminio Fraga in the transition to more flexibility and to the adoption of Brazil's inflation targeting. I was part of a team that the IMF mobilized to consult there. I didn't have the chance to meet Gustavo there in Brazil, so we will have to find a time for a good cafecito, whatever.
He says that he was on vacation, but...
Oh, okay. He chose an optimal time for vacation. I do think that, and I believe that this is the view at the International Monetary Fund also, that Argentina needs and will need a gradual move towards more flexibility, more freedom of capital movement, a gradual reduction of the cepo, and so on and so forth. For me, as an external researcher to Argentina, the thing that is extremely different from other countries is the problem of international reserves. Okay, so because you are very limited in terms of the fact that you do not have enough reserves, and so but on the other hand, I have many colleagues, and I'm sure that this morning some of them here sort of presented this view. Some people think that the moment Argentina moves towards increased gradual, I emphasize gradual flexibility, this will increase the credibility of the program. This will make the program internally more consistent, and this will make probably monetary policy more effective. And then it will attract more capital inflows and more investors. Because as I say, again, reading some of the research of my colleagues in Argentina, that there may be some investors that are waiting to see, here is something that to me is very puzzling. And I will make it short so that Gustavo can, of course, give us his insights. Almost all stabilization programs that we study, in the initial phase, they have a treatment, a management of the nominal side of the system, including the exchange rate and monetary policy, and the fiscal side of the system. Okay. In Argentina, for, of course, idiosyncratic reasons, the choice has been in the primera etapa, in the first stage, to focus on fiscal policy and to go to the zero primary deficit. And then it has been announced that issues of adaptation and flexibilization of monetary policy and exchange rate policy will be part of the second stage or the third stage. Okay, this is a unique phenomenon to Argentina, but on the other hand, it has generated expectations, and we cannot ignore that. And people and markets are expecting; they want to know when and how this will happen. And of course, the answer that we hear is that let us see how much progress we make with the program, and then we should be able to feel safer about moving in this direction. So I think this is the dilemma for you guys to resolve. But I would venture a point. I would not postpone it for too much. I would not postpone it for too much.
Okay.
Gustavo, one comment. It's interesting to dive into the experiences of the 80s, the heterodox cases in Argentina, Brazil, Israel. I studied those a lot in college. And then, well, it's different when you try to build something right now after all these experiences have taken place. Some failed, some succeeded. The toolkit is huge. There's a lot of possibilities. Right? Mm-hmm. But one thing that I should mention that I did in my presentation explicitly was politics, and I would like to offer a few comments on that. Very importantly, in the beginning, it was always like politicians telling us that we know nothing about the people, and we're always proposing evil things, right, to make people suffer, right? So fighting inflation was not popular, like inflation was popular, right? Well, 30 years later, that has changed almost upside down in the sense that today, inflation is not popular. Actually, there's nothing more popular than fighting inflation and winning over inflation. So politicians in Brazil at least learned that, they get elected and re-elected again and again if they sustain stability, right? That's a major change of the real plan, which buries into the ground the wisdom according to which inflation was good for the economic development, that provided resources for government to fight poverty, right? You tax the poor to fight poverty, things like that. So today we can say in Brazil that, see, democracy is the one thing that prevents inflation from coming back. Because if you start to inflate, you lose elections. As simple as that. And that is what you accomplish with a successful experience. For a while, that is sensed by politicians while it is happening. So they start to cooperate in the middle of the process as they sense this is going to work, and if this works, that changes everything in the realm of politics. And you have to have politicians to your side, or else you are not going to go to the end of it, right? And so the whole thing about politics of this is capitalize on your success, bring the guys to your side. At the end, you're on the right side, the side of democracy, the side of protecting people, protecting money. There's nothing more social, more inclusive, national than money. That's the responsibility of this House, the Central Bank of Brazil, to protect people's purchasing power. How could this be unpopular? Right? That's what a big stabilization experience teaches a country. We learned in Brazil, I suppose, right? I'm being optimistic here. But I think we learned. And today, politicians that in the past were opposed to the stabilization are saying things we could never think they would say in favor of inflation targets, fiscal balance, and all that. That's unbelievable. But it happens. It can happen.
Thank you very much, Gustavo and Leo. We could stay all day talking about these experiences and how they apply nowadays. We have a very tight schedule and interesting panel next, so I'll just want to give you an applause. Thank you very much for being with us.